Welcome to Scoring Student Work for the Grade 8 Science Measurements of Student Progress. The focus of this video is to provide guidance for scoring student short answer responses using rubrics. We will review one scenario, an associated item, and several student responses to that item. In this video, we will take a close look at the relationship between a scoring rubric and student responses for a short answer question. I will demonstrate the scoring process with 3 student responses for a new procedure question. You will then review other student responses in the same way. The goal is to determine the score 2, 1, or 0 for each response. You should have on hand the hot lamp scenario, a copy of the new procedure question, the rubric for the question, and the student responses for the question. This packet of handouts is available on the OSPI webpage next to this video file. This scenario hot lamp and additional associated questions can be found in the 2013 Updates for Grade 8 document. A link to that document will be shown at the end of this video. Please refer to these documents throughout the presentation. You may find it helpful to take notes or mark up your copies. I use highlighters when I'm taking notes. If you have not already done so, please pause the video and take a few minutes to read the hot lamp scenario and the new procedure question and write a response to the question. Please do not read the rubric until after you have written your response. When you are finished, continue to view the rest of the video. Let's begin our review with the original scenario. This inquiry scenario describes a controlled experiment in an Earth system. Inquiry scenarios can be either controlled experiments or field studies. This happens to be a controlled experiment. A short paragraph introduces the experiment on the first page. The experimental question and the hypothesis include the manipulated and responding variables. In this scenario, the manipulated variable is different lid colors, and the responding variable is air temperature inside a glass jar exposed to a lamp. A list of materials is given, as well as a labeled diagram to show how the experiment is set up. The second page provides a procedure with the steps needed to carry out the experiment and a data table with results. The lid color versus air temperature inside glass jar data table has the manipulated variable lid color in the far left column. There are 4 conditions of the manipulated variable: black, dark gray, light gray, and white. The rest of the columns are for the responding variable, which is the air temperature. There are 3 columns with trial data and then an average column. The numbers in the data cells are the measurements Brandy and Jerry collected as they did the experiment. The trial 1 data for the black lid was recorded in step 4 of the procedure, and the cells for the other trials were filled in as the procedure was repeated during steps 6 and 7. The average data was calculated as part of step 8. The procedure on this page is meant to be an exemplar for students to refer to when they reach the new procedure question. Students must be cautious to answer the new question we give them and cannot earn any credit on the new question if they copy the original procedure in its entirety. Now let's look at the new procedure question. Plan a controlled experiment to answer the question in the box. In your procedure, you may use any materials and equipment. Be sure your procedure includes logical steps to do the experiment, 1 controlled or kept the same variable, 1 manipulated or independent variable, 1 responding or dependent variable, how often measurements should be taken and recorded. Then the new experimental question is given to the test taker inside the answer box for paper tests and just above the answer box for online tests. Question: what is the effect of different amounts of water in a jar on the time for the water to reach 50 degrees Celsius? Then the word procedure shows where to start writing a new procedure to answer this new question. Please notice that the new manipulated variable is different amounts of water in a jar, and the new responding variable is the time for the water to reach 50 degrees Celsius. If you are working in a group, this would be a good time to pause the video and compare your responses. Now let's look at the rubric. If you have not yet read through it, please pause the video now and read all of page 1, then resume the video. Each short answer question rubric begins with the performance description. The performance description includes the content standard from the Washington State 2009 K-12 Science Learning Standards. The content standard describes what students are expected to know. The content standard INQB reads, different kinds of questions suggest different kinds of scientific investigations. The performance description also includes the item specification. The item specification specifies the knowledge and abilities that are to be assessed by the question. INQB Item Specification 1 reads, describe a plan to answer a given question for a controlled experiment. Links to the Washington State 2009 K-12 Science Learning Standards and the Grade 8 Test and Item Specifications documents can be found at the end of this video. The new procedure question is scored using a set of attributes that responses can earn one by one, and those attributes are grouped together to decide how many score points a response earns. There are 6 total attributes that can be earned on this question. 5 to 6 attributes earns 2 score points, 3 to 4 attributes earn 1 score point, and 0 to 2 attributes earns 0 score points. The bottom part of page 1 is broken out into small sections, with each section explaining one of the attributes of a procedure. The first attribute, one controlled variable, has some examples of creditable responses in an EG list. Note that whenever the rubric is quoting possible student responses, that text is shown in italics or slanted text. This list is not exhaustive, and students can use different words to express these ideas. The response must indicate that a student intentionally took a step to control some aspect of the experiment to make sure that there was only one manipulated variable. Back in the original scenario, a few of the controlled variables were the starting temperature inside the jar, see step 2, and the distance between the lamp and the lid, see step 3. The manipulated variable attribute has amount of water in parentheses, which comes from different amounts of water in the new experimental question. On the 5th grade MSP, we would provide actual amounts of water for students to use, but on the 8th grade MSP and the biology end of course exam, we give students the freedom to decide what those specific amounts of water will be. Students could use 1 cup, 2 cups, 3 cups, or 50 milliliters, 100 milliliters, and 150 milliliters, or any other amount of water that seems reasonable to them for a fully creditable manipulated variable. The responding variable attribute has time to heat to 50 degrees Celsius in parentheses, which comes from the time for the water to reach 50 degrees Celsius in the new experimental question. There are various ways for students to state this, but the procedure must include heating the water to 50 degrees and timing how long that process takes. The record measurements attribute is usually earned by students when they include a line like, record the time for the water to reach 50 degrees. This section also has 2 attribute notes. Attribute notes are further clarifications about how the attribute can be earned or not, and in some rubrics, how that attribute might impact the earning of other attributes. The trials or repeated attribute is earned when a procedure includes steps to do at least 2 trials for all of the conditions of the manipulated variable. If we look back at the original scenario, this attribute was earned by the inclusion of both step 6 and step 7. If step number 7 had not been included, then this attribute would not have been credited. You may also notice that most of these attributes include or data table if given, or something to that effect. It is true that including a data table as part of the new procedure can help earn some of the attributes, but I have to give a big word of caution here. A data table on its own, with no other supporting steps of a procedure, will not earn any attributes and will end up with a score of 0. A data table, if included, can only help clarify vague language in the steps of the procedure. It cannot earn attributes on its own. If students are testing online, there is currently no way for students to draw a data table in the response box. The most they can do is describe what the titles on the columns and rows would be. The last attribute is logical steps. The litmus test for this attribute that we explain to scorers is, are the steps clear enough that I could follow these steps and get pretty similar results to this student's results? The litmus test is not, is this a valid and reliable experiment? The second page of the rubric has a lot of information in it as well. If you have not read through it, please pause the video now and read all of page 2, then resume the video. This page has general notes which impact the earning of multiple attributes. General note number 1 states, if the response does not plan an appropriate procedure for the given question, the response may not earn any of the possible procedure attributes. The most common mistake students make on this type of item is not using the manipulated variable and/or the responding variable that was given in the new experimental question, which in this item are the amount of water and the time to heat to 50 degrees Celsius. If one of those is not used, then the response does not earn any attributes and gets a score point of 0. General note number 1 also lists some examples of other ways a plan is not appropriate, and again, this is not an exhaustive list. Some students repeat the original procedure word for word. Some only test one amount of water, so there's only one condition of the manipulated variable, which isn't really an experiment. Some responses change amounts of water but also change the lid colors, so there are 2 manipulated variables. Some write a prediction of what will happen without giving any steps of a procedure to test their prediction. And some, like Note 1D states, are just too vague to understand what the student intends. All of these types of responses do not earn any attributes and earn a score point of 0. General note number 2 is referring to this list from the question. Let me use an example to explain how this note works. The example reads, turn on the stove to 100 degrees. Put a pan on the stove. Put 1 cup of water in jar A, 2 cups of water in jar B, and 3 cups of water in jar C. Put all the jars on top of the pan. Start your timer. Take the temperature of each jar of water until the water gets to 50 degrees in the jar. Record how much time it took for the water to get to 50. Repeat 2 more times for trials 2 and 3. Controlled variable, starting water temp 24 degrees. Manipulated variable, time for the water to reach 50 degrees. Responding variable, different amounts of water. If we look at just the first paragraph, the response is pretty good. There is a creditable manipulated variable with the 3 different amounts of water and the correct responding variable. They repeated trials and recorded the responding variable. There might be a controlled variable in there as well, and it seems pretty logical, so this might earn all of the attributes. But then we have to look at the list the student gave us. They told us that the controlled variable was starting water temperature 24 degrees, but this wasn't included in the paragraph above. So the first sentence of note number 2 tells us that the response cannot be credited for the controlled variable. Next, they told us that the manipulated variable was time for the water to reach 50 degrees, which is wrong. They also told us that the responding variable was different amounts of water, which is also wrong. The student actually flipped the manipulated and responding variables around, which is a very common mistake that students make when listing out the variables like this. The student has essentially contradicted themselves by using the variables correctly, but naming them incorrectly. The second sentence of note number 2 tells us that the response cannot be credited for either of these variables because both uses of the variable must be correct to be credited. What all of this does to the scoring of this response is that a paper that started out earning 5 or 6 of the attributes for a score of 2 now can only earn the record measurements, repeated trials, and logical steps attributes, which is 3 attributes for a score of 1. We understand if teachers would like to hold their students to a higher standard in the classroom and require this kind of list when writing procedures in the classroom. Teachers are welcome to do that, but we caution you to be sure the students understand that they only have to use the attributes correctly for items on that Science MSP. They do not have to list them separately. And please be sure that students understand the scoring consequences if the attributes are listed incorrectly. The 2 types of mistakes shown in this student response are seen more often than not during live scoring when students choose to list the variables. General Note 3 is all about clarifying vague language in responses. Notes 3B, 3F, and 3H impact whether or not the logical steps attribute can be earned. Notes 3C, 3D, and 3E help clarify some different uses of the word repeat. Note 3B is the one most commonly needed. If a response includes a vague manipulated or responding variable, the response can still earn that attribute but automatically loses the logical steps attribute. We'll see some examples of this in the student responses in a few minutes. Now let's look at student responses. Response A says, 1. Gather all materials. 2. Place 10 milliliters of water inside a glass beaker. 3. Make sure the water is 25 degrees Celsius when you place it in the beaker. 4. Place the beaker with water on the Bunsen burner. 5. Start the timer as you turn on the Bunsen burner. 6. Measure and record the amount of time it takes for the water to reach 50 degrees Celsius. 7. Repeat steps 2 through 6 twice more to complete the second and third trial. 8. Repeat steps 2 through 7, this time replacing 10 milliliters of 25 degrees Celsius water with 20 milliliters of 25 degrees Celsius water. 9. Repeat steps 2 through 7, this time replacing 10 milliliters of 25 degrees Celsius water with 40 milliliters of 25 degrees Celsius water. As I talk about how the responses are scored, the attributes will be listed on the left side, and I'll use the same colors to circle the part of the response which earns the attribute. The first thing a scorer looks for is the manipulated variable. If the response does not include the manipulated variable from the new experimental question given in the box, the response does not earn any attributes, so it makes sense to check for that first. Response A includes 3 conditions of the manipulated variable, first in step 2 with 10 milliliters of water, then in steps 8 and 9 with 20 and 40 milliliters of water. So this response earns the manipulated variable attribute. The next attribute a scorer looks for is the responding variable, because that also must be correct for the response to earn any of the other attributes. Response A clearly states the responding variable in step 6, with the amount of time it takes for the water to reach 50 degrees Celsius, and earns the responding variable attribute. Now we can look for any controlled variables. This student was very intentional in telling us to use 25 degrees Celsius as the starting temperature of the water in steps 3, 8, and 9. We only need one controlled variable in the 8th grade MSP, so this response earns the controlled variable attribute. The record measurements attribute is earned in step 6, when the response says to record the responding variable data. The trials are repeated attribute is earned for a combination of steps. Remember that there need to be at least 2 trials for all of the conditions of the manipulated variable. Step 7 details how to repeat trials for the first condition, the 10 milliliters of water, including the step when the responding variable is measured, so this response is off to a good start. Step 8 and 9 give directions for repeating almost all of the steps of the procedure using the second and third conditions of the manipulated variable. And by including step number 7 in the set of steps to repeat with these amounts of water, this response earns the trials are repeated attribute. An example of a common mistake with repeats is if steps 8 and 9 in this response had only said to repeat steps 2 through 6. If we think through how that would look when following this procedure, we realize that data would not be collected for the second and third trial of the 20 milliliter and the 40 milliliter amounts of water. In that case, the response would not earn the trials are repeated attribute because only the 10 milliliters of water had repeated trials. Now we are down to our last attribute, logical steps. Remember that our litmus test for this is, are the steps clear enough that I could follow these steps and get pretty similar results with this student's results? As I read through this, there wasn't any language that tripped me up. Both the manipulated and responding variables were very clear, and there wasn't any qualifying language like repeat if you want to, so this response earns the logical steps attribute. So this response earns all 6 of the attributes, which means it earned 2 score points. For shorthand, we sometimes say that this paper is a 6 for a 2. Now let's look at student response B. Hang a light and put a jar under it with a thermometer and then time how long it takes to get from 10 degrees Celsius to 50 degrees Celsius, and do this for 100 milliliters of water and then 200, 300, 400, 500. The first thing we have to address is the multiple uses of the word it in this response. When scoring the Science MSP, we use some scoring guidelines for decoding pronouns like the word it. The first guideline I'm going to use is that we can break up compound or run-on sentences into separate sentences. So if we broke this long sentence into 3 sentences, the response could look like this. Hang a light and put a jar under it with a thermometer. Then time how long it takes to get from 10 degrees Celsius to 50 degrees Celsius. Do this for 100 milliliters of water and then 200, 300, 400, 500. The next guideline I'm going to use says to find a clear reference noun within the sentence itself. When I do that with the first sentence, I can replace it with the light and the sentence makes sense. Hang a light and put a jar under the light with a thermometer. Now if I try that with the second sentence, then we'd have time how long time takes to get from 10 degrees Celsius to 50 degrees Celsius, which does not make sense. The last guideline we'll use says that we can infer the meaning of the pronoun from a noun in the preceding sentence. Let's apply that to the second sentence. If we use the light or the thermometer, we wouldn't be measuring the time for the water to heat, so the response couldn't earn the responding variable. We want the response to have the best chance of earning the attributes, so let's try something else. We can infer that the jar will contain the water from the third sentence, so let's replace the second it with the jar of water, which makes perfect sense for this response. Then time how long the jar of water takes to get from 10 degrees Celsius to 50 degrees Celsius. These guidelines for interpreting pronouns are used to support the developing language skills of students, and in the case of this response, everything worked out well. But that is not always the case. Some student responses use the word it so many times that the earning of attributes or score points is negatively impacted. Our best advice to students is to avoid the use of pronouns and especially avoid the use of the word it. Now let's get to scoring response B. You'll notice that I've gone back to the original language from the response, and that's because scorers have to figure out how to read the pronouns and then remember while searching for the attributes. Response B has 5 conditions of the manipulated variable listed at the end of the response. 100 milliliters of water and 200, 300, 400, 500. So this earns the manipulated variable attribute. The middle of the response, time how long the jar of water takes to get from 10 degrees Celsius to 50 degrees Celsius, earns the responding variable attribute. The response gives a specific starting temperature for the water by stating to get from 10 degrees Celsius, which qualifies as a controlled variable. The response does not record any measurements of the responding variable, so does not earn the record measurements attribute. We only have one measurement for each of the conditions of the manipulated variable, so this response does not earn the trials or repeated attribute. Now to think about logical steps. There wasn't any language that tripped us up after we decoded the its. Both the manipulated and responding variables were very clear, and I'm confident that I could follow these steps and get pretty similar results, so this response earns the logical steps attribute. This response earned 4 of the attributes, which means it earns 1 score point. Response C says, 1. Get all materials together. Put 1 inch of water in cup. 2. Close the lid, wait 5 minutes. 3. Use a thermometer and check the water temperature. 4. Repeat steps 1 through 3 with 2-inch water and 3-inch water. 5. Record all data. First, we see that step 1 has 1 inch of water, and then step 4 has 2-inch water and 3-inch water, so we have 3 conditions of the manipulated variable. Then we are looking for the responding variable. Step 3 says, check the water temperature, and step 2 says to do that after 5 minutes. This sounds like the student is saying to measure the water temperature after 5 minutes. We should be measuring the time to reach 50 degrees, so that's the wrong responding variable. Since the responding variable is wrong, General Note 1 applies and the response cannot earn any of the attributes. As a result, this response earns 0 score points. At this time, please pause the video and read through the rest of the student responses. Look for the manipulated and responding variables first, then look for the other attributes. Use the rubric and your notes about responses A, B, and C as a guide to assign each sample student response a score, then return to the video. Check your answers. If you're working in a group, take some time to compare your decisions. Then let's look at the responses to see how each paper was scored. Response D earns 2 score points. The manipulated variable has 4 conditions. The first one is listed in step 1, and the others are listed in step 9. So the manipulated variable attribute can be credited, and we can look for more attributes. The responding variable is implied when steps 3 through 6 are looked at together. The use of the timer while checking the water temperature, especially stopping the timer when the water reaches 50 degrees, implies that the data recorded in step number 6 is the time for the water to reach 50 degrees Celsius. So this response is credited for the responding variable, and we can continue checking the response. Response D was credited for the controlled variable because of including 40 degrees Celsius water in step 1, which gives a consistent starting temperature for each trial. The responding variable data was recorded in step 6, so the response earns the record measurements attribute. The trials or repeated attribute is also earned in this response. The 10 milliliters of water trials are repeated in step 8, and the other conditions are repeated with the inclusion of step 8 in step number 9. Now for logical steps. There wasn't any vague language, and I'm confident that I could follow these steps and get similar results, so this response earns the logical steps attribute. This response is a 6 for 2 score points. Response E earns 0 points. This response is a prediction, but does not include any steps of a procedure to test that prediction, so General Note 1E applies and none of the attributes can be earned. Please note that it is perfectly acceptable for a student to start their new procedure by stating a prediction or hypothesis and then giving the steps needed to test that prediction. We know that teachers may require that in their classrooms and that this approach may help the students start their thinking. The inclusion of a prediction does not cause the loss of points. The issue here is that the only thing that was written was a prediction. When the prediction is the entire response, then the result is a score of 0. Response F earns 1 score point. Step 1 has the first condition of the manipulated variable, 300 milliliters of water. Step 7 indicates that there will be other conditions tested by stating with different amounts of water, but is not specific about what those amounts of water will be or about how many different amounts should be tested. As a result, we call this a vague manipulated variable. And General Note 3B applies. The response is credited for the manipulated variable, but loses the logical steps attribute. Steps 4 and 5 include using a clock to find the time for the water to reach 50 degrees, so this response earns the responding variable attribute. Step 2 names the starting temperature for the water in each trial, so the controlled variable attribute is earned. The response does not include any step where the responding variable data is recorded, so the record measurements attribute is not credited. The 300 milliliters of water condition is repeated in Step 6, and the different amounts conditions are repeated with the inclusion of Step 6 in Step number 7. So this response does earn the trials are repeated attribute. This response earns 4 of the attributes, which converts to 1 score point. Response G also earns 1 score point. Step 2 says to fill each jar with a different amount of water, but nowhere in the response are specific details about what those amounts of water will be or about how many different amounts will be tested. This is a vague manipulated variable, so General Note 3b applies, so the response loses the logical steps attribute. Step 5 very clearly states the responding variable, so that gets credited. Step 3 gives a consistent temperature for the oven that each jar is set into, so the controlled variable attribute is earned. The response does not include any step where the responding variable is recorded, so the record measurements attribute is not credited. Step 4 is making sure that each of the jars of water get into the oven, but that is just making sure that each condition of the manipulated variable is tested once. The response does not include any step for the manipulated variable to be tested again, so this response does not earn the trials are repeated attribute. This response is credited for the 3 variables, but none of the other attributes, so this paper is a 3 for a 1. Responses G and F are very common ways that students earn 1 score point on this type of question. Response H earns 0 points. At first it looked like the answer might be good, but then we read the last sentence, and it becomes clear that the student is manipulating the color of the lids just like in the original scenario. The response is not a copy of the original procedure, so this is not a General Note 1A, but lid colors is the wrong manipulated variable, so the overall General Note 1 applies, and none of the attributes can be earned, resulting in a score of 0. This response is an example of using the original scenario as too much of a guide and not changing both variables to match the ones given in the new experimental question. Response I earns 0 points. The first sentence has different amounts of water in 3 jars, so we know that there will be 3 conditions of the manipulated variable, but we don't have specific amounts of water. Remember, students at this grade level get to choose the amounts that seem reasonable to them, but they must be specific. This lack of specificity causes this to be a vague manipulated variable. General Note 3b applies, and the logical steps attribute cannot be credited. The second sentence clearly states the responding variable with measure the time for each jar to reach 50 degrees Celsius, so the response earns that attribute. There are no controlled variables, nothing is recorded, and there are no trials repeated. This response is a 2 for a 0. Response J earns 2 score points. The manipulated variable has 4 conditions. The 2 cups is listed in Step 1, and 3, 4, and 5 cups are listed in Step 6. So the manipulated variable attribute is credited. The responding variable is in Step 4. We can replace the word it with the water from earlier in the sentence. So Step 4 reads, put a thermometer in the water and time how long the water takes to get to 50 degrees Celsius. This makes sense and is the correct responding variable, so that attribute is credited. The controlled variable is in Step 2. Water is at 10 degrees Celsius. Measurements were not recorded anywhere in the response, so the recording measurements attribute is not credited. The 2 cups of water trials are repeated in Step 5, and the other amounts of water are repeated correctly in Step number 6. Therefore, the trials are repeated attribute is also earned in this response. The language was clear, the variables were not vague, so we can credit the logical steps attribute. Response J is a 5 for a 2. This concludes our look at student responses to this new procedure question. We hope this training has clarified how the rubric is applied to student responses for this type of question. Some key lessons we'd like you to walk away with are the importance of using the correct manipulated and responding variables in your new procedure. Remember, if those are not correct, then no points can be earned. Please be sure to choose specific amounts for the manipulated variable and avoid the use of pronouns, especially it, so that the steps of your procedure are as clear as possible to the scorer. Here are the links to the assessment documents mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. If you have any questions or comments concerning the Biology EOC, please contact Dawn Cope, Secondary Science Assessment Specialist, at 360-725-4989 or email dawn.cope@k12.wa.us. If you have any questions or comments concerning the 8th grade MSP, you can contact Dawn or me. I'm Kara Todd, Elementary Science Assessment Specialist, at 360-725-4979 or email me at kara.todd@k12.wa.us. Thank you for your participation.